glad you're here today, very early for some of you on the West Coast in particular, so sorry about that. We're here today to talk about the revised CAS standards for transfer student programs and services. And of course, we have to say happy National Transfer Student Week. You're beating me to it in the chat. But how befitting that we're celebrating transfer students all this week and now also doing a little professional development for ourselves as well, and centered here together to talk about transfer standards and how and why we do the work we do. So I am Emily Cottrell. I'm an assistant director here at NISTS. I'll be your MC for the day. So on behalf of Janet, Judith, and Joe, and all of us at NISTS, welcome. Thanks for being here. And I've got two fantastic colleagues who made this work possible on the call with me today. So I'll turn it over to them to say hi as well.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Wendy Kilgore. I'm the Senior Director of Research at AACRAO, and I'm happy to joining you today. And really want to give a shout out right up front, though. Emily's been the one getting this all together for us. So again, thank you, Emily, for doing that, and welcome, everyone.
Hey everyone, my name is Dan Bureau. I am the Associate Vice President for Student Wellbeing at the University of Kentucky. More important for today's context is I have served on CAS for 17 years, and me and Janet Marling back in 2011 were the ones that organized the group for the first set of transfer student standards. You can understand more later on as to why I was involved in that when we explain CAS land, but just so happy to be with you all here today. Happy Transfer Week.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also, we would be remiss if we did not give a huge shout out to the many, many folks who supported our CAS work. And of course, we'll give you more context of what all of this means, but just right from the top, we want to say a huge thank you to the experts on transfer across the country who sat with us in many, many meetings and talked a lot about transfer and what makes this work great, but also what makes it hard so that we could address that in the standard. So I'm sure some of them are on the call today, but just a huge shout out to our committee members whose names you can see there on the slide. Okay, now to get started, I'm going to launch a poll. We want to do just a quick touch base to figure out who is in the audience, because we've got a lot of folks here, not just from NISTS or AACRAO, but folks from CAS world. So you may or may not be familiar with CAS, may or may not be familiar with transfer. So just a quick poll. Go ahead and chime in. What is your familiarity with CAS? Are you just learning about it? Have you heard about it and you've attended a presentation before? Maybe you've actually used the standards and guidelines in your work, or maybe you're an expert and we should invite you to hop off mute and come on and help us talk about CAS. Let's just give everybody a quick second to see where we're at. Okay, well, I'll just give you a quick snapshot. If I end the poll, share results, here we go. I'm learning about CAS for the first time, wins by a slight hair. So good thing for you. We're going to cover all the bases, so don't worry. But we've got a good contingent of folks who are familiar and have used it before. So welcome, everybody. Let me get that out of the way. All right. So just to kind of level set, we're not going to do a deep dive into CAS. What you see on your screen there is sometimes affectionately called the blue book of CAS, and it is thick. I'm talking like 3 inches thick worth of stuff. So we're not going to go deep into CAS, but we are going to give you just enough information to help you kind of understand the context for why we did this work and how it could be useful to you. More specifically, we'll provide a little teeny tiny overview of CAS and what these standards are. We'll tell you a little bit about our driving ideas and influences throughout the revision process, which started a few years ago. And then we're going to talk just briefly about how you could use the standards in a self-study process on your campus to kind of get a snapshot of what's going well and could use improvement on your campus. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, I wanted to acknowledge Fiona in the chat. She's actually an undergraduate who's engaging today, which I love to see that. I'm so excited that we have these new refreshed standards in order to support students like you, Fiona. But CAS is both an entity where it is an organization. We'll talk more on the next slide about that, but it's also these documents that kind of can frame good practice. And so every CAS set of standards starts with a contextual statement. That contextual statement outlines the history, the background, the modern day challenges, issues, opportunities, as well as what it might look like going to the future in terms of the functional area. We also have our sets of standards, and we'll talk more about those later on too, but there's 12 sections. That's a very comprehensive approach to understanding how a functional area might be organized, structured, and the goals that we're working towards. And then the last thing is we have self-assessment guides. And throughout today, we'll talk a little bit more about this. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there's a QR code. I think that Wendy at some point put in the chat, but it got really crowded in there. So we'll put it in there again, the link to the CAS website that will allow you to access the website, our store if you're interested in purchasing products. And spoiler alert, later on, we actually have a discount code for you because it is National Transfer Week and you all want these standards so badly. So yeah, that's CAS as an overview. More about the organization at large, though, is that to some extent, I'm an imposter in this space because I don't live in your land. I've worked in student success here at UK and in other places, but I've never directly done transfer work. But what I'll say is that CAS as a consortium, which has been around for over 45 years, we currently have over 40 associations. AACRAO and NISTS are two of them. But I serve on behalf of the Association of Fraternity Sorority Advisors, one of the other 38 associations. I've served since 2017, and all these associations have had up to 2 representatives that serve to represent their organization. So we don't have members; we have associations who are members. We currently have 50 plus sets of standards. We have transfer, we have esports, we have basic needs, we have multicultural affairs, res life, all those different sets of standards. You name it in terms of student services, we probably have a set of functional area standards for those. Why do we create standards? You know, CAS was founded over 45 years ago. It was born from the NASPA and ACPA, and there was a need to provide frameworks to conduct good practice within student affairs programs and services. We are not an accrediting body. We believe strongly in self-assessment and the opportunity for units and divisions and institutions to reflect on how things are going by examining how they are aligning with this comprehensive framework. And whether it be to set up the organization in the unit or to assess it, we enable practitioners to do good work because we have these standards. They've been grounded in the research around the field. Again, across those 40 plus organizations, we bring that interdisciplinary approach. I was able to chair the functional area, worked with Janet Marling in 2011, as well as with Emily and Wendy in this latest go round. But we bring in an interdisciplinary approach, we bring in experts, we bring in expertise across all 40 associations in CAS. Next slide. So, you know, CAS is often thought of as a prescriptive framework that we have to follow every single step. And I want to assure you all that CAS is not a policing body, it's not an accrediting body. As I said before, we strongly believe in this idea of self-assessment, internal improvement, and ethos towards working towards continuous improvement around the programs and services that we enact. And on this call are representatives from large research institutions, two-year institutions, publics, privates, online programs, etc. You name it, and our standards can be applicable to you. But we have 4 primary ways that we promote the application of these standards. One is, and many of you on this call might be interested in doing this, you might be creating a transfer student area right now or in a different aspect of the campus, but you want to create its own unit, the standards could work for you. If you wanted to talk about how you achieve outcomes, both learning and programmatic, around how to enact transfer student services on your campus, within your institution, we might be helpful there as well. Certainly, as we looked at how these units tend to be pretty small, 1 to 2 people, starting out brand new, you want to figure out what are the priorities for the unit. The CAS standards can be helpful there also as you focus your time, energy, and resources on developing the programs and services that work best for your institution, regardless of institutional type. And we're often known for our program review model, which we'll talk more about later on. But really what you want to think about CAS is as a framework for continuous improvement. That is the development of the objectives, the strategic foci, the operational processes you're going to enact, all those kinds of things that allow you to create effective programs and services. So now I think Emily's going to talk more about the revision process that we enacted over the last few years.
Yes, thank you, Dan. And as Dan mentioned, he and Janet and a group of folks got together way back in about 2009, 2010 to write the very first edition of these standards. And you can kind of think just a broad overgeneralization is, how do I do the work I've been tasked to do? So these standards are an attempt to compile all that information and give you some guidelines and some parameters around, if you work in transfer, maybe do this. And so they got together back in 2010. And if you've been around as long as me, you might remember that back then there wasn't a ton of research about transfer yet. I mean, it was definitely a thing, but the focus was on vertical transfer and the student experience a little bit, and what is our role. And so they really were starting from scratch. NISTS as an organization started in 2003, so we'd been around for a little while. And just around 2010 is when we were trying to formalize transfer practice and get everybody on the same page. So back at that time, transfer was seen very much as a transition. And so a lot of the transfer standards looked like orientation guidelines, because that was kind of the office task back then, to make sure a student could come in and get situated really, really quickly. So the information available was limited, the practice was limited, our understanding was limited, and it was really, really, really perfect for the moment, because it did what no one had ever done before, which was try to formalize transfer programs and services. But if you fast forward, our process for this revision started in 2023. And since then, the research floodgates over the last 15 years. I'm no librarian, but I suppose if you got into Galileo or whatever it's called and you searched transfer, you would see 2011, 2012, 2013 is when transfer success really became a huge thing. And so we've got a ton of information now to sort through and to understand, not just vertical transfer, but lateral transfer, reverse transfer, what transfer stigma is, so many elements, transfer receptive culture, transfer capital, transfer agents, transfer efficacy, so many new principles to really dig in. And so we took a lot of time to look through the literature, figure out what was most important, what people needed to know. And I'm very pleased to say that our committee members, right from the very beginning, were all very well aligned, regardless of if they were in admissions, registrar, transfer centers, community college, four-year advisors. We wanted these standards to represent the broad nature of transfer work, because it isn't just orientation, as we understand much better now. So we were focused on making it applicable to lots of different units, everyone who's involved in transfer, but also the sending and receiving institutions, because it is a shared responsibility to make sure students are supported throughout that process. We also were very well aligned that we wanted to take a holistic approach and acknowledge that transfer success may not map exactly to the traditional retention, progression, graduation metrics that we so often are trying to improve. Certainly that's a part of it, but not every transfer student is trying to get to a specific four-year degree. So we wanted to meet students where they were, regardless of institution and whatever their needs happen to be. So with that, I am gonna start to turn it over to Wendy. Just as Dan said earlier, the contextual statement is what CAS uses to kind of compile all of that, you guessed it, contextual information, the stuff that brings the standards to life. They're pretty formal, so you can't address it in the standards themselves. So you use this contextual statement to unpack these important principles that you want your readers to be aware of as they're going towards the standards. So I'll just give you a very, very quick snapshot. We are not going to go in depth here, but every contextual statement hits these sort of 6 areas. And so for us, we focus very specifically on some key tenets, current trends, and persistent challenges. And for the purpose of our conversation today, we're just going to dig in a teeny tiny bit on barriers and then a couple of the other trends that we were really top of mind as we dove into revising the standards. So I'm going to turn it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Dan, for that wonderful introduction there. Emily, would you mind populating this slide? So I'm going to briefly talk about the barriers to transfer success that we identified as a committee through the research, through people's experiences that helped shape the contextual statement and the revised standards. So, I'll go into detail in a few other slides here, but these are the 4 that we identified as the collective barriers to transfer, and they served as our framework for how we reviewed and looked at and revised all the stuff we did with the contextual statement and standards. Next slide, please. So the barriers are not in any particular order. We're just numbering them 1 to 4, but that does not imply a hierarchy to the barriers. A diffuse or inaccurate information. A lot of research talks about how transfer students and prospective transfer students need additional information. That still applies now. They even just research from the Student Voice Survey 2025, a few months ago, 82% of respondents in that Student Voice Survey said they needed more information about transfer. It's required to be on institutions' websites, but websites can be outdated pretty quickly. The information can be hard to find. We also sometimes we have staffing where we are understaffed to support this particular population of students. And this can impact student decision-making. So there's all kinds of judgment and decision-making research that says if you have incomplete information, your ability to make a good decision about where you're going to transfer to can be negatively impacted. So it can either have you be overly optimistic and overly confident in that match when you get to the institution, or sometimes turn away from an institution because you may feel that you're not a match because you don't have all the information to make the decision effectively for yourself. So this really applies a lot to students who are transferring or applying to multiple colleges and trying to figure out where they fit. So diffuse or inaccurate information really is sort of this umbrella component that applies to a lot of institutions. And at no fault of their own, there's just a lot of information to try to convey to transfer students, and it often is not in one cohesive place. Next slide, please. Course transferability and credit articulation issues. So we've heard a lot in the research and other webinars about credit loss or excess credit, so the overaccumulation that impact transfer students. So credit loss could be a combination of, the students have explored a major before they transfer and they didn't understand the transfer rules, so they took classes they thought would apply and turned out not to. And same with excess credit accumulation. They thought they needed classes because the information was diffuse or not hard. It was not clearly articulated to them when they were still at the sending institution what was required for the major. And some of the credit loss and overaccumulation, though, is also student choice and course taking behavior. So we're not saying institutions are entirely responsible for credit loss or excess accumulation, because student choice behaviors, their course taking choices. Did they repeat a class because they wanted a better grade? Did they change majors? Did they take a bunch of classes like that were outside of their major because they wanted to, because they just wanted to take those classes? So it's not entirely on the shoulders of the institutions about that aspect, but institutions can help students understand those course taking decisions and how they will impact when they do transfer. Sometimes there's misaligned requirements and varied numbering systems that again contribute to this confusion about how do I figure out what to do when before I transfer. That there are a lot of efforts right now to apply technology to this, and whether or not the student has applied to the institution, there are institutions that now put a forward-facing solution that are leading the field, where a student can say, oh, I'm at this institution, I'm taking these classes, tell me how they apply, and I've met the standards. So that is starting to emerge. And limited course availability as an example during transfer registration. So let's say your institution lets all the direct entry students and continuing students register first before transfer students do. That can leave transfer students in a pickle, because they're like, oh gosh, I work and I have limited hours where I can go to school, but I need these classes and they're not available to me. So we have some of those kind of things. Next slide, please. Financial challenges, the hidden costs beyond tuition, financial aid gaps sometimes between what's offered to transfer learners versus what's offered to the direct entry students. And as I said before, the balancing work, family, education, and expenses. So how do institutions take all those things into consideration when you're providing information as a sending and a receiving institution to these learners? That's a pretty complex challenge. Are you going to do like if they're a swirling transfer, are you going to do a consortium agreement where your financial aid at your institution applies? Are you going to put out for specific transfer student scholarships pools available to people? Do you have a team of dedicated financial aid advisors, perhaps, that understand or can explain to the transfer learner how much time they have left based upon what they've used at the other institution or institutions. Some of these students participate and use financial aid at lots of institutions. So that's barrier number 3 in a nutshell. Next slide, please. An ambivalent campus environment. So sometimes we're hearing, recent research has actually highlighted this, assumptions about faculty assumptions in particular about transfer student abilities and preparedness. So that is something that our standards and our contextual statement and the work that everybody's doing around transfers, it's not necessarily underprepared. They can do just as well or better than your direct entry students. But it's trying to break a culture of these assumptions about transfer students' abilities and preparedness that has existed for quite a while. And as we all know, changing culture is difficult. There's also that stigma and self-doubt among transfer students, especially if they get to that place where they're saying, where do I want to go? And they don't have that information. That omission, neglect, the judgment and decision-making theory says, I'm not sure whether I can make this decision, whether I'm going to be successful or I'm not being told by the institution, you're welcome, come on board. Here's all the information. Here's the folks to talk to. And by some students, transfer students who experience that lack of information, then go, oh, that institution doesn't want me. And that is, I'm sure, not true, but that could be how they're internalizing it, and that can affect their decision-making about whether to attend that institution. There are some rationalized neglect in institutional structure. So, by that we mean sometimes we could say, oh, we can do one orientation, and that orientation will meet the needs of both transfer student and direct entry learners. That's what we have the resources to do. That's what we have the time to do that. And we think that transfer learners, because they've already been in college, they don't necessarily need to have some specialized orientation to our institution because they've already been there, done that, and bought the t-shirt. So kind of like we make this assumption sometimes in institutions, and not in any mean way at all, but just as kind of a belief, an assumed belief, this rationalized neglect in institutional structures. So those are the barriers that drove us and the committee to do the work we did in the last couple of years. I'm going to hand it back off to Emily.
Thanks very much. And so I'm going to address now sort of the second very major overarching idea that we were all in agreement on across the committee. And that is the idea of what is the transfer student experience. And I alluded to this a second ago, but for a long time, transfer, we've acknowledged there's a student and they go to one school and then they go to another. And so we looked at that point of literal transition. You're done at one and you're starting the other, and a lot of transfer work focused just right there. And so we're very intentional about saying, actually, let's take a holistic view. We want to look at the entire breadth of the transfer experience, from the moment transfer is even an inkling in their brain, all the way through to their goal completion. And so what happens on this very complex journey, all of that should be incorporated and thought about as you're thinking about transfer student support. So one of the models we used is sort of based in NISTS thinking around this phases approach. And I'm going to go through them just very briefly with you. We're not going to go into detail here, but we were intentional about naming these in our committee because, as you'll see in a second, if you name things, that can help you understand what types of things are supposed to happen at that phase in the journey. So we start with planning, which, in a nutshell, getting ready for transfer. Then you go through the matriculation process, and that's all the stuff you have to do before that first day of classes. You get through the adjustment phase, which is getting used to the new campus environment. Then you integrate and feel connected and start to figure out how to get involved in whatever way suits you. And then you get to completion. And that's got a little asterisk there because it is partially completion of your goal. But for transfer students, they may or may not hold on to that transfer identity for a long time after their transfer. Maybe after their first year, they feel like, well, I'm not a transfer anymore. I'm just a Nighthawk, or I'm just a Bulldog, or I'm just a whatever. So completion there is when they feel like they're a full part of the campus community and they're fully integrated and well on their way to meeting their goals. Now, planning, matriculation, adjustment, integration, and completion. You may be looking at this and be like, okay, genius, whoa, thanks for that astute naming framework. Well, and you're right, these are very obvious, but it's intentional because we want to take a student perspective and we want to use words that everybody can get an inkling of what we mean by those words in the face. So we're not masking anything, but we're very intentional about this because of the barriers that Wendy just named. even though freshmen may go through a similar sort of phases of experience, even if they're traditionally first-time freshmen, they're not necessarily facing the same barriers that transfers are encountering along their journey. So we wanted to really overtly acknowledge that as we were working on the standards. The other part, though, is that we want to think about how departments can collaborate better to help support transfer student success. In higher ed, in our work, you may have heard this expression, we get a little siloed. It becomes very easy to focus on what we're doing because we know how to do it and we feel really confident and we can kind of be in our little box, in our little bubble, and that works well for a lot of reasons. But it can be detrimental, particularly for transfer students, when they're needing information and connections across all of these departments. And so the phases approach helps us not say, oh, well, admissions is your first stop, registrar is your second stop, orientation is your second. It really blends and makes that a gray connection point so that we can collaborate. And in the standards, we did name very specifically advisors and faculty members and program directors of like majors and academic programs. We named those folks very specifically in the standards as key partners in transfer work because the research is showing increasingly that advising, for very obvious planning reasons, you need to have connection to advisor to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row as you're going through the transfer process. But there's just also an integral connection point and an affirmation point, a validating point for transfer students as they navigate. And then, of course, faculty see them in the classroom all the time, and that's really important for preparation and integration purposes. But they're also creating those degree maps that the transfer students have to follow. And so faculty and advisors do get a particularly special shout out in the standards, but everyone working together is key. And so this is what we mean when we say putting students at the center. It's all departments working together, but it's also institutions working together. So the sending and the receiving doing what they can to partner and make sure students are supported at every single phase of that very complex journey. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dan to tell you a little bit more about the standards themselves.
Yeah, and I love this idea of when we state it clearly, when we're intentional with it, then we can actually do things about it. That whole what do you do from planning to completion? The standards can do that for you. Going to the next slide, all of our standards across all 50 plus functional areas, and again, I gave some examples earlier, transfer is just one of those, consists of 12 different parts. Our standards and guidelines, our standards though consist of standards that are across all 50 plus. We refer to those as the general standards, and we refer to the unique functional area standards. So transfer student, registrar, residence life, campus activities all have things in common, which allows for, I see we have a couple folks in the chat today who are doing divisional program review. I think that it allows for this idea that transfer can be part of a larger collaborative effort in order to elevate programs and practices. But these 12 sections are across all sets of our standards. If it's a must statement, we believe that that is a elevated or a strong practice for the functional area. And if it's a should statement, it allows you to amplify or kind of see a way that it might be enacted. And going to the next slide, that recommendation for enactment is really going to be dependent on your context. And the mission of the organization as espoused within the standards is that it is to ensure successful transitions for all transfer students and remove barriers to their success, right? That's our broad statement. And then we identify 4 bullets under that that talk about this idea of providing guidance and access that is collaborative, that we are working with partners both inside the institution as well as outside the institution, across institutions, across systems in some ways, that will allow students to receive the services, receive the pathway in order to enter institutions, transfer among institutions in the way that is most seamless and beneficial to their learning. And then the last thing is we really have a strong sense of advocacy within the mission of this. Now, it's important to articulate here that because we want these to be applicable in whatever context you're working in or whatever way you are structured, is that one, these can be both centralized or decentralized. So you can use these both to enact a unit, but also to create a larger approach to enacting this across departments. And we'll talk more in a minute about one of the benefits to a collaborative model. But also, it's this idea of like, we need to weave this throughout everything. So you will see in the standards that these components of mission are woven throughout all 12 sets of our standards. One of the things to think about with CAS standards too, because transfer in particular is a younger functional area or one that is emerging as standalone versus maybe part of a larger function, is that these can be both realistic in terms of what we can do tomorrow, and then also maybe more aspirational in terms of what over time we might be able to build towards. And so going to that next slide, we'll talk more about that because I think for many of you, and I think our poll revealed this, Emily, that the majority of our audience is new to CAS. They haven't applied them previously. And so kind of the question oftentimes when we talk to people about using the standards, which can feel a little overwhelming given their depth and their breadth and just a lot of words and a lot of expectations, start with a few key areas in order to develop the approach that you all need. Our recommendation might be to give a lot of weight to sections 2, 4, and 8. Section 2 focuses on the objectives of the program. What is it that you want to achieve in order to enact that mission? I'm going to skip to number 8 because I think when you're looking at centralized versus decentralized, but also just the nature of the work that you all are doing anyway, whether it's centralized or not, it has to be collaborative. And we have to communicate broadly about what we're trying to do across the institution in order to invest all people in supporting transfer students at whatever stage of the process they are, or as Emily talked about earlier, in terms of wherever they are in terms of adopting their identity as a student within your institution. The assessment piece is super important. It's important to examine our outcomes that we're trying to do that in a way that is fair and equitable and honors the needs of all of our transfer students. But I think for maybe a first year of a program, if you just wanted to start with these 3 sections, that would be a great way to lay some foundation for implementing these standards in a more robust way. If you want to do a self-assessment, you can use our self-assessment guide. That guide is a tool that takes you through step by step what it would be like to actually evaluate a program. Again, I know we have some folks here that do that work within their divisions, within their institutions. This is a helpful tool for someone to not only use the standards, but to assess the extent to which they are aligned with those standards. And going to the next slide, we'll talk more about why self-assessment could be beneficial for you. And again, we are jumping a little bit from many of you because you are still not familiar with the standards. It's important to enact them. But as you're thinking about enacting them over time and moving to a place where you might evaluate, you could consider evaluating at the very beginning, which would allow you to prioritize a plan for the future, right? So I'll talk through this with you, but whether you're doing a self-assessment now or down the road, these are some of the reasons why, how you might be able to enact these, how you might implement this. So first of all, you have to make this internally driven. This is not an accreditation process. Though CAS standards can be helpful in documenting the extent to which we contribute to institutional priorities for accreditation, it is simply a chance for you to internally reflect on what is working within your set of standards, within this set of standards. You need to make them contextually relevant and helpful. I get a lot of questions that are like, well, what if we don't think we do well with this standard? Well, is it a priority for you right now? Or, hey, this standard over here is, we're doing great here, we're not doing well here. What does that mean about our program? What it probably means is that you're building infrastructure, or that it means that you're building towards a place where you're doing things, really well here, but maybe down the road you want to plan over here for the future. The thing about using like the self-assessment guide and the CAS standards is that because these have been vetted across the different associations, and there's a lot of great connection across functional areas, but I think more importantly to me, when institutions or associations vet these standards and they say, hey, we believe in this, we're going to promote these as well, you're going to see other functional areas recognize the importance of transfer student services within their institutions, particularly if you do have a program review model. And then I think that it's just important to have that kind of ongoing regular reflection. I would always encourage an annual examination about how you're doing. It doesn't have to be a full-on review every year. So how do you go about doing it? You have to make this effective in terms of the time, the resources you have, those kinds of things. I think everyone thinks that you have to do this like perfectly. No, do this the best you can and then see what happens from that and then build on that for the future. I think it's important to know going into what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to achieve perfection? Probably not. But you are probably trying to examine where it is you can improve, where you can allocate more resources, those kinds of things. Evidence, reflection, it has to drive your determination and your alignment. When you do the self-assessment, what I have seen often happen is that departments might think they're doing something well, but they don't have evidence to prove it. And so at some point, the self-assessment process has to be grounded in strong evidence. And then ultimately, when you do these self-assessment processes, it allows you to be collaborative and focused on shared goals. Every time you you go through the self-assessment process, you develop a plan in order to enact items that might be priorities for the short term and long term. That allows you to engage with partners and say, let's work on this together. So what's the SAG look like? You can see on the screen here an example of that. All of our SAGs provide some examples around what evidence could look like. People get hung up on that a lot in terms of like, do I have to have everything? Is this all a bunch of surveys, focus groups? What is it? No, it just has to have some level of evidence that you have worked towards the achievement of the standard. And it's up to you internally to determine whether or not that's sufficient or not. But again, you go through this exercise, you determine if you feel that you are compliant or not, and then you take action on that depending on what it is internally you want to achieve. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, and I'm happy to meet with some folks offline, talk more about how you might enact this. And I think very few of you are probably in the place right now where you are doing this. But typically, if you're going to do self-assessment and program review, you might follow a model. CAS does have a model that is 7 steps in nature. We always recommend at least 1 year in order to conduct a thorough self-assessment and program review. But if anyone has questions, you'll be able to contact me after the fact. This is a model that we present as an option for you all. So ultimately, when you go through these processes, whether you are a department or whether you've been around for a little while, there are some great outcomes to this. And I will tell you that I have done 14 or 15 campus reviews for different functional areas. And I always hear, we didn't want to do this, but we're glad we did. And I'm working with my power department here. They're our health and wellness area, and they're doing a program review. We have some reviewers coming to campus next week. And what I'll say is that they were very nervous because they did not feel they were achieving their goals. The thing is, though, is that doing it at a point in time where you can review and reflect and then intentionally plan for improvement, that's the power of doing self-assessment and program review. Now, possibly there's a recognition process. I think it's important to individually contextualize in your institution within the functional area how you're going to celebrate wins, how you're going to work towards improvement. But ultimately, after doing this, you're going to see more of a shared vision among the constituents that are invested in the success of your program for transfer students. Going to the next slide, I think this is my last one here, but I just want to reiterate too this importance of having goals that are unique to what you need at your institution within your context and where you are in your program. I loved what Emily explained earlier about the say it, then believe it, or whatever it was. It was just this intentional application of the standards is so important. So even if all you do is you get the standards and you review them and you have them as a framework, that's a great way to use them. If you reflect on those and you apply them on an annual basis, quarterly, whatever, and maybe work as a team to talk more about how you're doing in one section, at a staff meeting, whatever, that's also a great way to apply these. Ultimately, over time, we hope that these standards will help you build culture in not only in your unit, but within your institution in terms of supporting transfer students. We believe that when they're proactively applied, they can be most responsive to what you need as an institution. And I think end of the day, for people that I've seen work through these standards in other functional areas, as a result, they tend to elevate what they're trying to do and certainly achieve their objectives and outcomes more effectively.
Yeah, and so with that, thank you, Dan, for the great overview on why these are so important to the field. You've got a QR code there, but I'm going to pop the URL in the chat as well. The standards are out there. They are available in the CAS store. And if you use the code transfer 2025, you can get a 25% discount off of your purchase today. And I assume the code will work for a few days. We didn't get confirmation on that, but I think it will. So please send it. If you're not in charge of your budget, send it to whoever is. Send it to your assessment team, your IR office, if you have one on your campus. But we hope you'll go out and get these. and read them and let us know how we did. It is a fun and incredibly challenging experience to try to sum up your entire field in a few pages. So hopefully we hit the target and gave you some really useful wording to use as you think through, what am I doing? Why am I doing that? And what kind of evidence do we have to support it? So the standards are there. We hope you will get them. And we do want to spend just a couple of moments taking questions if there are any, and then depending on how time goes, maybe we talk a little more about an individual section if you guys have questions there. But we know Transfer Week is very, very busy, and probably some of you on the East Coast are having to log off in a minute anyway to go to your 12 p.m. program for transfer students. So we are here for questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat or in the QA box, and we'll address those. And I'll leave the QR code up for a little while for those who need it. But I do have a couple questions in the box we'll address first. And Wendy, one of them is for you, I think. Can you tell participants where they can go to learn more about the student voice survey that you mentioned?
Sorry, trying to find my mute button there. Goes hiding sometimes, right? Yes, the student voice survey is actually one produced by Lucian, and I can try to find the URL and let you put it in there in the chat. Okay, I'll do that.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And then we've got another question that's really thoughtful around dual enrollment. And it's a little bit long, but I'll try to read it so that everybody's all on the same page. But thank you, Kelly, for this. Regarding over accumulation of credits and misalignment, has there been work around early college credit in the updated standards? As dual enrollment practices continue to expand, the challenges related to these metrics increase. And we go on to talk about sort of the importance of making sure that students who are taking part in dual enrollment understand that transfer pathways are available and that they're taking classes that will actually ultimately count towards whatever their goal happens to be. So Kelly, I've got kind of a two-part answer to your question, and I also open it up to Dan and Wendy to comment on. But first I'll say in the standards, we've very specifically defined transfer students as those who are after high school graduation, have attended one institution and are trying to take learning credits to another institution. And we did that for this very reason, because the dual enrollment bucket is very murky. And we realized that they are transferring, but we didn't want to make the standards sort of a double barrel thing addressing more than we possibly could. So we had to be really specific and focused on what we knew most transfer offices or most transfer people could address. We completely acknowledge the importance of dual enrollment and actually talk about it a little bit in our kind of looking ahead section. And Dan, you'll have to tell us if dual enrollment is one of the functional areas, because I don't even remember if they have their own standards, but it'd be worth looking into because of this very reason. But we do throughout the standards talk a lot about making credits clear and transparent, and then the transfer process efficient. And so I think that was an attempt to address pieces of this. As well, part 2, you can actually see it on the screen there. And you can't see the part that I'm about to talk to you, but part 2 goes on to talk about the types of programs and services that you might provide if you serve transfer students in your office. And we actually kind of bucketed it into 4 categories. And it's information, so providing really clear information. It's providing guidance around timely decision making. It's around helping students build belonging and community, and then it's around that credit efficiency and transparency. And so in each of those areas, we tried to speak broadly enough that we're focused on transfer, but dual enrollment slides into each of those very specifically as well, because they need exactly the same kind of holistic, accurate, available information and guidance throughout the whole process. So completely acknowledge dual enrollment is important, but the way the standards are written, we couldn't say specifically like, and so if you're doing dual enrollment, do ... It's sort of wrapped in. Dan and Wendy, do you want to add on anything to that? I hope I explained it okay.
You did. Thank you.
Okay, and I see some questions coming through on the chat also, so I'm going to try to address those. And thank you, Wendy, for putting the link to the survey in the chat there as well. Okay, so Dan, you might be able to address Fiona's question better than I can. It's in the chat if you can see it. And Fiona, maybe you have more context there, but do we work with policies, or do we maybe provide insights to change improvement policies? if you want to address that, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think both you and Wendy probably have some expertise in your respective areas, but CAS does incorporate into all its sets of standards one section on policies, laws, both federal and local laws, in terms of how functional areas might follow those and enact those. And so within the transfer student programs, you'll see both the general standards that cut across all 50 relative to policies, but then also those that are distinctive to transfer students there as well. I know AACRAO does a lot within the policy space also, but I'll stop there.
Yes, AACRAO does a lot in the policy, like benchmarking and recommendations for policy space. And if your institution is a member of AACRAO, Fiona, you can actually become a member of AACRAO as a student or just on your own as well, and have access to that information for policy guidance and research on it if you're interested. Anyone else?
Yeah, and I would just say, Fiona, if you're talking specifically about the standards and how they may or may not address policy creation, you will see the word policy pop up a billion times in the standards because we're trying to put attention on specific policies around certain topic areas. So certainly recommendations are sort of threaded throughout the standards for transfer specifically, although no examples because of the way the standards are written, but policies are obviously key to transfer efficiency. And so we do reference those quite frequently in the standards themselves. And also, I just want to acknowledge everybody. If I were sitting in your shoes, I'd be like, what are these standards? I totally understand it is so hard to know if you've never read a standards document before, how these come across. So you can kind of see the examples on this slide there, but it'll, I think, make more sense when you get in there and give it a read. I would not try to read them all in one sitting. It's a lot and it will make your brain tired, but you could certainly visit it over a few days. Rebecca's question is a great one. Am I correct saying these standards sound focused on receiving schools? How could community colleges use it? And Rebecca, you'd be right to think that because it is often transfer. Oh, it's the receiving school's responsibility, right? We very intentionally tried to straddle the line between make these applicable for sending and receiving, because we know that both sides have such an important role in helping transfer students. And so there may be places in the standards that you'll read it and you're like, oh, that's not me, that's them, and vice versa. And there's just, it's very difficult to not name both specifically because we're not necessarily allowed to do that in the standards. We're having to talk very broadly. But that's why we took that sort of next level approach to say, if you're doing transfer work, look at this, this, and this. And I think when you get in there and read them, you will be able to challenge yourself to say, does this apply to me? Yes or no? And I do suspect you will be able to say yes the vast majority of the time, because if you know who your transfer students are, you can do all of the things. And so that's a piece that community colleges sometimes have formalized and sometimes don't. Do you know who are your transfer intending students on your campus and how are you addressing their needs? So we did try to straddle the line, but just by virtue of transfer, some of it may come across as more receiving than sending. And Dan and Wendy, please feel free to chime in there as well.
Only thing I'll say is I think the ethos of the standards is strong for either. I think that there's things in here that you can use to inform your practice as well as to potentially assess.
Yeah, and we had community college folks on the committee to help keep us in line, so their input was definitely key to help us do that. Nancy, is the CAS assessment piece included in the transfer student programs and services document, or should we get the big book? So there's two things on that page where you go to the URL. There is the separate PDF for the standards, and that's one thing that you purchase. And then there's a separate document for the self-assessment guide or the SAG, and you purchase that separately. So you don't have to buy the whole book. You can buy just those two PDFs if you want. But Dan, you may be able to talk about whether their institutions have subscriptions or something to the
Yeah,
standards
some of
already.
you would have a subscription. Maybe you could work with your divisional assessment person. One thing I will say is by buying in the SAG, you also buy the standards. So I would invest in the SAG, and then you can get both. I think the contextual statement is also in the SAG.
Oh, nice. I haven't actually opened it, so I don't know the answer to that question. I'm trying to get through the chat here, so give me a moment as I get through these. Oh, how and where do you acquire training? Well, I'm so glad you asked, Loida, because AACRAO is great. NISTS is great. I mean, I'm biased. NISTS is great, but you can go to either of our websites. NISTS in particular, I don't have it handy, but maybe one of my colleagues on the call can pop a link to our resource center on our website. There's all kinds of webinars, publications, blog posts on NISTS. And then of course, AACRAO has lots of policy databases and community boards as well. So there's so much out there. And I happen to know of a couple of really great transfer podcasts too. One of them through AACRAO called Transfer T, one of them through our friends Transfer Nation called Transfer Nation Talks. So there's lots out there. And if you don't see your primary association serving transfer students and giving you enough content, I say you tell them so. I know that they would appreciate an email saying, hey, we want more of a focus on transfer, but certainly you're free to reach out to us and we can point you to specifics if you've got them. And Wendy put something about the Learn Commission in there. I'm super excited about that. I just want to double check for questions. Wendy, do you want to talk about the Learn Commission and the link that you put in there?
Oh, sure, just briefly, because it took me a while to find it, but it's going back to the question about the dual enrollment. So we have the Learn Commission is addressing dual enrollment and transfer, and they will have recommendations specifically on that, the practice and policy to support that. And there's just the green paper that is a benchmark of current practices. In that, we found that basically most receiving institutions, about 98% of them, treat dual enrollment credit in particular. I'm not talking about student services, but dual enrollment credit, just like they do their transfer credit. So they're consistent practices. It's not always been that way, but it is moving that way now.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm super excited about the Learn Commission's recommendations that are coming out in the next month or so. So be sure you watch either the AACRAO listserv or the NISTS mailing list and be on the lookout for that. Wendy and I are both on the commission, and that's been so excellent. And the commission is hugely possible because of Wendy's research work behind the scenes. She's a machine, everybody. So I always take my hat off to Wendy's excellent research whenever I can. There's a couple of other questions in the QA box, so thanks for putting those in there. And Dan, you may have to help me address some of these. I'm looking at one from Adina about international admissions and transfer applications. And the question is, can you talk about international transfer students and are they covered in the diversity section or other sections of the CAS standards? So I'm going to give sort of a blanket answer, and then Dan, if you have some follow-ups there, but it's kind of the same as with dual admission. Just by nature of the standards, you can't single out specific sub-functional areas. So by virtue of the broad nature of the way we wrote things, international students could be addressed under some of those same guidelines of what information they need, how do you support them holistically, what data should you look at, that kind of thing. But there are separate standards for registrar services and for admissions, undergraduate admissions, and those standards may address international more specifically. But Dan, do you have comments there?
Yeah, no, I don't recall them being explicitly stated in the standards, and they would not be in Section 5 per se. Section 5 tends to be more around the policies that are enacted in order to ensure equitable environments. When we identify student populations, it's typically in Section 2 for programs and services. We do also have international student services standards as well.
Yeah, appreciate that, Alan. Thank you, Dan. And Mandy, I see your question there, and I think at our peak, there were probably 20 people on the committee trying to meet monthly to work on different facets of the standards. So 20 people contributed their expertise, so we couldn't have done it without their help. And just for Cindy, just want to recap. Did you say when you buy the SAG, it comes with the standards as well?
Yes.
Yep. And is there an expiration to use the discount? To be honest, Eleanor, we don't know. They didn't tell us, so use it. I suspect it'll be up for at least a week or two, Dan. What do you
Probably
think?
a week, yeah, typically.
Probably about a week, so try to get
Yeah, if
that.
I put my email in the chat, I'll put it in there again. If people have questions and they try to apply it in the next week or so, it's not there, just let me know. I'm happy to follow up with them.
Okay, any other questions? I really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you for being here to engage about the standards. We hope you'll get them. We hope they're helpful. And we hope that you're having a fantastic National Transfer Student Week. So particularly for those of you who have to dash off to your next tabling event or maybe your pizza party for transfers, I don't know. You probably have lots of great things going on, but we thank you so much for your time. And my special thanks to Dan and Wendy who helped shepherd this process. And we just appreciate you all. And we love the work you're doing. We know it's tough, but keep hanging in, keep doing the great stuff, everyone.
Shout out to Janet Marling too, the mother of transfer standards.